In this video, I'm going to analyze an incident that happened to me a few days ago with one of my students. This student ended up landing in the sea. In other words, he ditched or water landed. I want to emphasize that the result was not due to the student's mistake. In fact, he did his flight very well and followed the instructions correctly. The cause was probably a combination of a bit of bad luck, because during the summer months the weather in Miraflores is a bit unpredictable, and some mistakes that I attribute to myself as the instructor when making decisions or giving guidance. But the student reacted excellently. He didn't get hurt, not even a scratch, thanks to his quick and correct reactions. To give you some context, in Miraflores in Lima, we fly dynamic. We only use the sea breeze that hits the cliffs and rises. It's a very simple flight, very easy, very predictable. We know exactly where the lift will be found and how much wind is needed to gain altitude. It's very rare that we have to land on the beach, especially when we are flying with students, because we only take them out to fly when the conditions are perfect. That's practically the whole year, except for a few weeks in summer, let's say, between the end of January, February, and some weeks in March. What happens during those weeks? It's very hot, and even if we measure good wind with the right direction, and we see other paragliders take off and climb perfectly, sometimes when we take off, we suddenly get caught in a wind gradient. That means there's like a double layer. We take off with good wind, but just a few meters lower, we hit a layer with no wind, and therefore we can't climb. That's something quite common in the hottest weeks of summer. So, what happened to this student? He took off with excellent wind. There were many paragliders flying without any problem, but he lost a few meters, caught a wind gradient, and couldn't climb again. Here you can see how he takes off perfectly, then descends a few meters. I tell him to turn right, toward the lighthouse, where the lift is usually stronger. But those few meters he lost made it impossible for him to reach the rising airflow again. And you can see here how, even though he stays close to the cliff to use the wind, instead of going up, he stays level or even starts to descend. At this point, I tell the student over the radio to keep his heading, not to get too close to the cliff because it could be dangerous, and to follow the contour of the slope. Here, the slope gets a little lower, but the wind still hits it well. If there's dynamic lift on this slope, it usually works pretty well. The student stays close to the cliff, but when I see that he isn't gaining altitude, it becomes dangerous for him to keep that distance. He could end up over the road. So I tell him to turn left and go land on the beach. So I tell him to turn and head toward the beach. Now, something important to mention is that this beach is called Punta Roquitas. It's the largest beach in Miraflores where you can land. I usually prefer that the student makes his approach in the middle of the beach, not from the very beginning of it. Let's say this would be the start of the beach. Why? Because in this area, there are some obstacles that could be dangerous. There's a high-voltage cable that goes from the top of the cliff down to the beach. There's a pedestrian bridge, a parking area for cars, and usually a lot of swimmers. So I always try to avoid that zone and have the student make his approach from the middle of the beach instead. Since the beach is very long, it's not necessary to start the approach too early. Under normal conditions, the student begins the approach from the middle and ends up landing safely in this area of Punta Roquitas, which is quite safe, not many people and not many obstacles. Then I tell the student to make big ears. But here I notice something unusual. Instead of slowing down and losing altitude, which is what usually happens here because the wind comes from the south from this direction, the student keeps flying quite fast and doesn't lose altitude. What was happening? That day, there was a kind of lift cushion, an ascending air mass over the beach. The day was so hot that the lift was not near the cliff but over the beach itself, which is not very common, But sometimes it happens. That small cushion of lift made the student stay up instead of descending. And since he wasn't losing height, it was very likely that, with his big ears, he would end up too close to the pier, or even hit it. So I told him to release the big ears and focus on passing the pier. That was the priority, to clear the pier safely. And here we can see how, just barely, by a few meters, he manages to pass it. That pier can be very dangerous if we hit it at high speed, because the rocks are very big and sharp. The impact could cause a broken foot or leg or a serious injury. So my main concern was that he passed the pier, and he did very well. Usually with normal tide, this whole area here is dry. Let's say the waterline reaches about here. But that day, the tide was particularly high. We can see how the waves reach almost up to the pedestrian bridge, which is very unusual. It was so high that the swimmers and surfers barely had a narrow strip of sand to stand on. Normally, they use all this area to place their towels and umbrellas. The student lands, and there were just a few centimeters of water. Sometimes this happens to us. And what we do is we throw the glider toward the sidewalk side, and nothing happens. But since the tide was so high, a wave came immediately and covered him completely. He lands, tries to kill the wing toward the sidewalk, but the wave instantly covers him, both him and his paraglider. And here comes the dangerous part. If he had been a little farther out to sea, and if nobody had come to help quickly, the risk is getting tangled with the lines. Fortunately, there were many swimmers around, and they helped him immediately. This is another serious danger, when the paraglider covers our heads. That can make the pilot feel trapped, unable to reach the surface, and panic. That panic could even lead to drowning. If that happens during a water landing, you must stay calm. We know that we can pull the glider off over our heads quickly, or even dive underneath to exit from another side. Luckily, in this case, the student was very close to the shore, and just by standing up, he was able to solve the situation. He also got help right away. You can see how more than 5 or 6 surfers immediately pull the paraglider to prevent it from being dragged back into the sea, and they also help him stand up. Even though you can see the paraglider being pulled several times, fortunately, it didn't suffer major damage. Both the student and the glider came out almost unharmed. The student didn't get a single scratch, and the wing only had 2 small tears and a couple of broken lines. Getting out of the sea is always hard when there are waves. It looks dramatic, but if you stay calm and move carefully, you can get out safely. The real danger is when the pilot panics. The waves come, push you, you fall again, but little by little, they'll push you toward the shore. Another important thing to mention is that all our students fly with a life jacket. In this case, the life jacket failed. We can see how it inflates, but deflates immediately. We inspect them every year, and we probably discovered a manufacturing defect in some of these jackets, which I'll explain in more detail later.
The trick to avoid damaging the paraglider is to wait for the wave to bring it toward you. Instead of pulling it yourself, you just hold it. Hold it still so the wave doesn't drag it back. Then you wait for the next wave to push the paraglider closer to the shore, and you hold it again. Little by little, that's how you get it out safely. Because if you try to pull it when it's full of water, you'll tear the fabric from the inside. Here we can see that the student is already in a semi-dry area. The waves still come and bother him, but he's already out of danger. It's very exhausting, that's for sure. We were lucky that there were about a dozen surfers and swimmers who went to help right away. That made the risk of a serious accident almost zero. With so many people helping, the student was able to stand up quickly.
Well, this student went through everything. His life jacket didn't inflate, the lines tangled around his feet, the paraglider covered him completely. Everything that could happen in a water landing happened to him. And what saved him was landing close to the shore and having so many people willing to help. I've always had this question in mind. In situations where the student is heading toward a dangerous obstacle, like rocks, the pier, or a wall, there are 2 options. Either hit the obstacle or tell him to go out to sea and land on the water. In all the times I've had to make that decision, I've never told a student, go to the sea, land in the water. But I always had that doubt. Maybe that would have been the best option. Now, after this video, I don't have so many doubts anymore. I can see that, here in Lima, landing in the sea can be extremely dangerous. If this student hadn't received immediate help, the outcome could have been very different. On the other hand, landing in an obstacle area might cause a fracture or an injury, but it won't go beyond that. So the conclusion is, always avoid landing in the sea at all costs. If you have to land hard, even in a zone with obstacles, it's preferable. This time, we were very lucky, but we can't always count on having that much help around. When I saw what happened, I came down with another paraglider, but it took me a couple of minutes, maybe more, to get there. That's enough time for someone who doesn't get help in the water to face a fatal situation. Another lesson from this incident is that the life jacket is a great help, but it can fail. And in a situation where the pilot gets tangled with the lines and covered by the glider, even if the life jacket inflates, the pilot could still panic and drown, even in shallow water. We can see here that the student was standing in just a few centimeters of water, but still, being tangled with the lines, a person could drown just lying face down, unable to stand up. However, the life jacket has saved paragliders before, both solo and tandem, so it's 100% recommended. But as we saw, it can fail, so it shouldn't give us a false sense of security. Another important lesson is that even if we see other paragliders flying higher and perfectly, we must be especially careful during the hottest weeks of summer here in Miraflores. Those days can be very deceptive. If we're going to take a low-experienced student for a flight, it's better to wait until the day cools down a bit, or be completely sure that the student won't end up landing on the beach, especially on a day with high tide. We must always pay close attention to the tide. In this case, I was overconfident. Even though at La Pampilla Beach, the one where we usually land, the tide looked high, I thought that at Punta Roquitas it was normal. So I believed that, in the worst case, if the student had to land there, he wouldn't have any problems. What I didn't imagine was that lift cushion over the beach, which forced him to pass Punta Roquitas and end up at La Pampilla, where the tide was extremely high and there was no shore at all. Therefore, if at the nearest beach to the takeoff point, La Pampilla, there's no dry space to land, then, unfortunately, that day students should not be flying. And we could even include tandem flights in that restriction. Because if something like this happens with a passenger, the risk and the problems multiply. Having a passenger who knows nothing about paragliding or who doesn't know how to swim could make them panic, and rescuing them could be extremely difficult if immediate help isn't available. So we must be especially cautious during the hottest weeks of summer and on days with very high tide. Well, and you might be wondering, what happened with the life jacket? Let me explain. These are the life jackets we use in Miraflores. Normally, we check the right side, which has the CO2 cartridge and the automatic inflator. But on the left side, there's this manual or oral inflator. So, if the jacket deflates or doesn't have enough pressure, the person can inflate it manually through this tube. If you read the instructions, they only recommend checking the automatic inflator part. This one, on the left, isn't even mentioned. And what happened with the student's jacket was that this part here, this inflator, was completely dry and worn out. It had come loose entirely, and that made all the air escape the moment the CO2 cartridge inflated the jacket. So the jacket became completely useless. We learned a great lesson. Check both sides. The right side with the automatic inflator and gas cartridge, and the left side with the manual or oral inflator. That would be all regarding the analysis of the student's water landing. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. See you in the next video.